All right. Well, so for those of you who are viewing this webinar, welcome. Originally, I presented this back at the end of February with OSU's Agribility program and their Caregiver Support Network. For those of you who weren't able to make it or are just hoping to review some of the material I covered, I hope this provides a nice overview of the caregiving experience and some ideas on how to address caregiver burnout. So you can go ahead and advance the slide. And I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm Dr. Teresa Young. I am a licensed psychologist. I've been in the mental health field for about 10 years now. My primary practice is psychotherapy, and I see folks both in person and through telehealth. My contact information is on the screen there. I've had a variety of experiences in different settings. I initially began working at an assessment practice. I've also worked in university counseling centers, VAs. Physical medicine and rehab was my most recent employment before I went into private practice. So I've had a lot of experience with a lot of breadth and depth of different age groups and presenting concerns. And what I'll tell you is that the caregiving experience reaches across all of these. Even when I was working in a university counseling center, students had ill parents and ill relatives that they were caring for or had to make difficult decisions about staying in school. I also worked with parents who had children with developmental disabilities. So caregiving is something that reaches out across the lifespan. I also have some personal experience. And the day that I presented this back in February was actually the 2-year anniversary of the day we lost my mother-in-law to glioblastoma, also known as brain cancer. And so my husband and I were lucky enough to travel about once a month down to Louisiana to help offer some relief and resources to my father-in-law. And we were also able to do a little bit of caregiving from a distance, helping him meet some needs that were less proximal. So this is an area that's very near and dear to me. You can go to the next slide. So an overview of what I'll be talking about today. As if you didn't know already, I'll be speaking to the caregiver experience. You'll probably read through these slides and think, oh, wow, yeah, that's exactly what I'm going through. And sometimes just putting words to your experience can be very helpful. I'll review with you a few things to look for when it comes to caregiver burnout, as well as identifying a few barriers to obtaining support. So I like to think of things on an ecological level. So it's not just about individual personal barriers to support, but also familial and sociocultural barriers as well. And I'll speak more to that later on in the presentation. And then we'll conclude with a discussion on planning for action. So what are some things that you can do yourself to get started relieving your caregiver burnout, even as we speak? You can go ahead. So if you're watching this, what I would encourage you to do is to try to give your full attention and awareness to this moment. If you've decided to take the time to look through these slides, to watch this presentation, I want to encourage you to take that time. A lot of times caregivers have divided minds where they're worried about their loved one, and they're also trying to engage in their own acts of self-care. So I give you permission, and I want you to give yourself permission to find peace in this moment and to give yourself 100% to this activity. Go ahead. And this was a story that's actually from a book called Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb. It just came out in the last few years. But she kind of describes the caregiving experience as trying to go to Holland, or trying to go to Italy, actually, and ending up in Holland. So I'll read the slide to you. The plan you set out for your life is like planning a trip to Italy. You buy a bunch of guidebooks and decide what you want to see and experience. So maybe the Colosseum, gondolas in Venice. You learn some Italian phrases, and you pick out restaurants that you want to try. And after lots of eager anticipation, the day finally arrives, you're ready to go, you've packed your bags. Several hours later, the plane lands and the flight attendant announces, "Welcome to Holland." So of course you're going to be completely shocked by that. Um, you might even feel angry or try to bargain, kind of circling through some of those stages of grief that are all too common in experiences like this. When you're faced with a caregiving situation, you can stay in your hotel in Holland and be upset. And of course, it's normal to feel upset. You had planned to go to Italy. This wasn't what you thought your life was going to be like. But if you spend all of your time in your hotel room, you're going to miss the windmills and the tulips and getting to know this other culture. And that's really very similar to what happens in a caregiving experience. Yes, it's very sad, and the expectations you had about how your life was going to go is very tragic, and it definitely represents a loss that needs to be mourned. At the same time, there's a whole community of new experiences that you could expose yourself to in this new culture and this new way of living. So I encourage you to think of your caregiving experience in that way. You can go ahead. So let me talk a little bit about caregivers. We know that a little less than half of caregivers are actually caring for their parents or for their in-laws. Folks who are kind of in this in-between stage where they're caring for young children or even adolescents, and then also for their aging parents, we call that the sandwich generation. About 10% of caregivers are caring for a spouse. And caregiving is akin to working a part-time or even a full-time job. People tend to spend between 24 and 45 hours a week caring for a loved one. And more often than not, caregivers tend to be women. Even if it's a family where older adult siblings are male, it usually falls on the oldest female sibling who ends up caring for parents. Okay, next slide. A few other aspects of the caregiving experience. So whether you are caregiving for a child who has developmental disabilities, or you're caring for an adult who has an acquired disability, so maybe they've had an accident, or someone who has a neurodegenerative disease like dementia or Alzheimer's, there's always new and changing responsibilities. So at baseline, your responsibilities might be new to you, but as children get older, as diseases progress, or as complications happen, your responsibilities are constantly shifting and changing. And that can be very difficult for some folks to feel grounded, especially when you're trying to establish a routine. Another common experience to caregiving is role confusion. So oftentimes your parent has been this kind of guide or this source of support and light for you. And maybe because of whatever they're experiencing, you're now feeling more parentified. So you're having to take care of them as if they were children. Also, you might expect if for example, if you have a child who has a developmental disorder, you might expect them to progress. Usually around 18, kids go to college and move out of the house, but those roles aren't necessarily the same under these circumstances. And when you're caring for a loved one, remember the time frame that people tend to allocate towards doing that. You have difficulty meeting your own personal needs. Often we'll see folks prioritizing doctor's appointments and therapy for their loved ones, and they tend to put off their own primary care appointments or their own needs for self-care, like exercise and healthy eating. And there's a host of challenging emotions that come along with the caregiving experience as well. Folks will feel guilty if they happen to take time for themselves and might become resentful either of their loved one or of their family members who are not stepping up to help as much. I think one of the strongest issues within the caregiving experience, and especially at a time like this when we're faced with a pandemic, is intolerance of uncertainty. there's just a lot of unknowns. We really don't know how long something's going to last. And that in and of itself induces a lot of anxiety for people. And of course, there's a sense of grief. So maybe you're mourning the loss of the life that you thought you would have. You're mourning the loss of the person. And even anticipatory grief is a huge part of this as well, especially if you're caring for someone who has a terminal illness. So you're kind of anticipating their death event as eventually happening. Go ahead. So we've got a lot on this slide, so I want to give you a moment to review it here. And when we were doing our caregiver workshop back in February, I asked folks to raise their hand if they experienced at least one of these, and everybody did. I asked them to raise their hand if they experienced 3 to 5, and then more than that. So more often than not, people experience signs of burnout quite often. There are a few here that I want to highlight. So snapping at people becomes one, feeling more isolated. When you are caregiving for someone and your body is in a constant state of stress, it makes you more vulnerable to other colds and physical illnesses. I want to highlight unhealthy coping behaviors because it's not uncommon for people to turn to smoking or having an extra glass of wine at night, things like that. And every once in a while, sometimes in moderation, those types of behaviors are fine, helps you blow off steam. But if you notice that you're doing it often, that's when it becomes problematic because it's usually at the expense of other coping behaviors that you could be engaging in. Other people might feel or might experience more somatic complaints. So they might begin to feel more headaches or digestive disruption. And again, that's all related to experiencing chronic stress. So your body needs to feel a certain amount of stress to keep you alive. It's wired to do that. And so often, if you think about being chased by a bear in the woods, it's not a great time to use the restroom. So often we experience different disruptions in our digestive tract even when we're in a state of prolonged stress. Some very serious concerns related to burnout are thoughts of wanting to hurt yourself or your care recipient. So maybe you've become so angry with them that you push them or something like that. Or you've had your own thoughts of just wanting this situation to be over. Those are very serious signs that you're experiencing burnout and need to ask for help right away. And we'll talk some more about that later on. If you're not as in tune with whether or not you're feeling burnt out, one of the best ways to know is if someone has actually told you that you seem that way. Our friends and loved ones often serve as a mirror, and they might hold up to you, geez, you seem really down or you seem really stressed. And they're not saying that to be mean or critical of you, but they're really highlighting what they're experiencing and the kind of the vibe that you're putting out into the world. So these are some different signs of burnout I would encourage you to review and think about as part of your caregiving journey. We can go ahead. So then we'll talk a little bit about some individual barriers to seeking support here. So one of the things that people often struggle with, and I see this so much both in my practice and historically, is people have a really difficult time asking for help or learning to delegate. Of course, no one is going to take care of your loved one as good as you, but sometimes you just need someone else to step in so that you can take a break. We also have a difficult time asking for help because we assume that other people don't want to be bothered and are really busy. I encourage you to think about times when someone has reached out to you and asked you for help and how that made you feel. More than likely, you were thrilled to be able to offer a meal or give someone a ride. So when you ask for help or you request it from someone, you're really giving them the opportunity to feel good about themselves. And that pays off quite a bit for both of you. Other barriers on an individual level would be not seeking out community support. Maybe you're feeling like you just don't have a grip on things and you're just trying to make it day to day. So staying organized is difficult. Sometimes, as our means of coping, we tend to engage in a certain level of denial. So we don't really plan for the future. And unfortunately, that's when we end up having to make really critical, difficult decisions in the moment where emotions are already high. So one of the things that you can do right now to find more support both for yourself and to feel more in control is to plan for the future. Have some idea of what things are going to look like as your loved one's disease progresses or as they advance to different developmental stages in life. Another really common individual barrier is being really unkind to yourself. Some of us have this little inner dictator who says we need to buck up and just keep going. And that's not particularly helpful in those types of situations. This is a situation that calls for self-compassion, where you need to be kind to yourself. Sometimes I'll recommend to my patients that they think of themselves as a friend. And what would you say to your friend? Would you tell them that they need to buck up? Or would you put your arm around them and say, I'm sorry you're going through this right now? And go to the next one. And of course, there are some family barriers to support as well. So I already talked about the commonalities with women tending to be more direct caregivers than men. So gender is a significant barrier there. It also becomes a barrier with spouses as well. And sometimes that can make the difference between whether or not someone is in a facility or is able to live at home. And what I mean by that is if there aren't more sharing of different types of chores, then when one spouse becomes injured or is unable to do certain things, the other spouse is often more reliant on others to do that. So it might be meal preparation or taking care of things around the house. And that can have implications for how things look down the road. Again, age is another familial barrier, in part because of the sandwich generation, or if both caregivers are getting older, um, then there's also the risk of that person needing some caregiving of their own. I've often worked with a few caregivers who are in their 60s, kind of facing their first bout of some type of chronic illness, such as diabetes, and they're also caring for a loved one in their 90s who needs a lot of support as well. Geography can also be another barrier, in part because we just have a more travel-friendly world, I guess I would say. It's less common for people to live in the same community where they grew up. And so certain family members might live several states away. That doesn't mean that they can't still offer support. So for example, my husband would work on some of the finances while his mother was sick. And that was one way that we were able to contribute to the caregiving situation, even though we were geographically separated. Again, career and stage of life can also impact the caregiving situation. So if somebody is just starting off a career, or maybe they're approaching retirement and want to save as much vacation time as they can, those things can also impact their ability to provide care. And my personal favorite, and the one that comes up quite a bit in my clinical work, is family history. When we were doing this workshop, I asked everyone to, or those in the audience, to raise their hand if their family communicated effectively all the time and they resolved conflicts very easily. And absolutely no one raised their hand. So we all come from families that have a certain degree of dysfunction, some more than others. And sometimes those dynamics can play out, usually weddings, funerals, and difficult situations like this with caregiving will really highlight some of the challenging dynamics that existed within families. So that can become a real barrier to obtaining support as well. Next. And then last, there are sociocultural barriers. So these are wider, bigger issues around caregiving and the way that we look at it. So nowadays, people tend to just have a lot more demands placed on them, in part because of social media and The expectation of checking emails after you get home from work, things like that can cause a huge barrier on a more cultural level. There's also a really big financial burden with obtaining caregiver support. So a lot of home health organizations and things like that are wonderful, but they do cost money, and financial planning can be really difficult. I'll touch on a few others here as well. I think insurance and medical coverage and privacy tend to be pretty self-explanatory. But I want to touch on the reputation of facilities, because I think there's a misconception that, if someone gets to be a certain age, you're going to throw me in a home or something like that. And facilities certainly have their place. They're usually staffed with high quality, passionate people who care about your loved ones. Of course, there are exceptions to that, and those are the ones that we're more likely to hear sensationalized in the news. But sometimes the person's caregiving needs, especially if it becomes a need for round-the-clock care, can be better handled in a facility. And so I want to dispel the myth that putting someone or having someone go live in an assisted living facility or a skilled nursing facility is a bad thing, because a lot of times that's exactly what that person needs. I want to also touch on, especially since we're doing this with the Agribility program, is the lack of resources depending on geographic locations. I am now living in Columbus, but I just moved here last year from Eastern Iowa, and that was an area where these types of caregiving resources were more scarce than they are in a major metropolitan area. So that's another barrier that we might experience if you live in more of a farm community or a place that's geographically isolated. Next slide. All right, so now that we've talked about the barriers, I've hit all the negative stuff that we need to be aware of, I want to shift focus, right? Because some of these things we can change, some of them we can't. And so I want to shift focus into planning for action. And I think that always starts with understanding where your strengths are. So what is it that you're able to bring to the table that's going to help you through this caregiving journey? I have a few examples on the slides here. Sometimes people struggle with identifying their personal strengths. And what I would suggest to you is to think about, what have other people said that they like about you? Maybe it's that you're incredibly patient, that you can really wait somebody out. Or maybe it's that you always seem to be very hopeful and optimistic. And I want to underscore humor and gratitude here, because I think those both go a long way. I once had a patient on rehab who said being on rehab reminded him of a Mel Brooks movie. And that was his way of sort of distancing himself from the pain and the immediate turmoil of being on rehab, to generate this sense of humor about it, to be a little bit more easygoing. And of course, having a sense of gratitude can really help with things as well. Who are you thankful for in this moment? What types of events are you thankful for? Those things can really help bolster your resiliency. All right, next slide. So another common concern that I get is people will say, well, whatever you need, I'll do it for you. Or sometimes I'll ask my patients, what do you need in this moment? And it's not uncommon for me to hear, I don't even know what to need, right? So a lot of times when people are feeling overwhelmed by their caregiving situation, they're not even really sure where to start. And so I usually offer this menu to them to kind of help narrow down their areas of need. So some people might have more of the day-to-day stuff locked down. They have transportation, they know who's preparing meals, but maybe they feel less comfortable or more overwhelmed keeping friends and family informed. Or maybe they're more worried about the long-term issues like managing finances and legal work. So this list can really help guide you toward what it is in each moment that you're needing. And this might change, of course, because your responsibilities change, you might need to readjust and return back to this needs list. And I want to underscore here, it's in bold, self-care, right? Because even if you are taking care of all of the admin stuff and your loved one is well taken care of, self-care is something that everybody needs to do. Go ahead. So let's talk about that in a little more detail. There's lots of different things that you can do to take care of yourself. And this is something that I encourage you to experiment with. So it's not the case that I expect you to do one self-care activity and that's it. You've taken care of yourself for the entire year. Just like you don't tell someone that you love them one time and it's a blanket thing and you don't have to say it again. Self-care is something you have to practice and return back to over and over again. So one of the things that you might do is do a mindfulness practice. And you can be mindful and breathe deeply at any time of the day. It's nice if you can sit in a quiet room and take some deep breaths for an extended period of time. But really, mindfulness is just paying attention to your thoughts and feelings, allowing them to be there without saying that they're good or bad, right or wrong, fair or unfair. But just being in the present moment with it. I find it helpful to say something to the effect of, I'm observing that I feel blank. So you might say, I'm observing that I feel anxious. I'm observing that I'm worried about this. And that's a practice in and of itself of mindfulness where you're not attaching yourself to those thoughts, you're just moving forward, taking deep breaths, and observing yourself. Another way to take care of yourself is through journaling. So maybe you will just free write whatever it is that you're thinking, or you can come up with different prompts like, I feel this, I'm worried about this. I find that writing things down actually helps slow down your thought process and helps you articulate what you're thinking so that you don't get caught in a negative spiral. And as I talked about earlier, a huge aspect of caregiving is this uncertainty piece. And we begin to feel a lot of anxiety around that, in part because we like to think we have a lot of control over our lives. So one of the ways to get some control back might be doing 3 small tasks. So when you're feeling that intense anxiety, do 3 small things that help you feel more in control. So maybe that's getting up and walking to the end of the hallway and back. Maybe it's deciding what you want for dinner. Just something very easy and simple and quick. I also encourage people to engage in creative problem solving. A lot of times when we're trying to come up with a solution, we tend to head things off at the pass. We talk ourselves out of stuff before we've fully considered them. And when we're doing creative problem solving, we leave everything on the table. So I'll often suggest to my patients, well, why don't you move to Bora Bora? Of course, you probably won't do that, but let's keep it on the table. What if you just stopped dealing with this? Let's fantasize about that for a minute. I know you're not going to do it, but let's keep it on there until we come up with some other solutions. Another self-care activity is doing one thing or acknowledging one thing in the last hour or several hours that's gone well for you. So trying to identify something positive and why. So for me, I think in the last day or so, I went on a walk and was able to appreciate all of the spring buds coming up and things like that. And I did that because that's the thing that I wanted to focus on in that moment. It made me feel more connected to people on a universal level. So identifying one thing and why, one thing that's positive and why. Of course, exercise is kind of the ultimate self-care activity. It's easy to let go of our health, especially when we're overburdened with caring for other people and taking care of our families. So I encourage you to find some type of exercise that you find appealing. For some people, walks just don't really do it for them, and so maybe doing yoga or Zumba or whatever can be really helpful. Just getting your heart rate up and getting a little bit of exercise is really helpful. And sometimes you just have to experiment to find the approach and technique that's right for you. I'd also encourage you to create a happiness list. And list stands for likes, interests, and satisfying things. Take some time to write these down so that when you do actually have a dedicated piece of time to engage in some self-care, you're not spending that time wondering what to do. You've already got a list at your disposal of things that are satisfying for you. Thank you, ma'am. And then there's interpersonal self-care. So there's a lot of people who can help you on this journey. And if there's anything that you end this talk with, it's that you need a whole support group. You can't be the only person who knows how to take care of your loved one. And so in order to have a good support group, you need to recruit people who are able to engage in different behaviors that add to the caregiving experience and that are committed. So when someone reaches out to you for help, encourage them to think about what they're willing to do, what their strengths are, and how much they're willing to commit. Doing this work on the front end prevents a lot of resentment down the road. So maybe somebody really has the great intention of planning for meals, but it's just not realistic for them to do it any more than once a week. So have people articulate that up front. You can also use people who offer to take care of or help you with your caregiving to your advantage, right? So if somebody is a really good cook, but maybe your loved one doesn't really like spending a lot of time with them, ask them to prepare meals instead of coming to visit or taking them to appointments. Similarly, if cooking isn't really in someone's wheelhouse, maybe they can come sit with your loved one while you go to a class or while you go for a walk, etc. Keeping your family members informed can be particularly difficult. So it's more common for me now to see just getting tons and tons of text messages. So holding family meetings can be helpful. Having an email newsletter or a social media group can be really beneficial in those circumstances. And this is something you can enlist the help of a younger student or a teenager to do, right? They're on their phones anyway. Say, hey, why don't you set up a group for the family so that I can keep them connected with what's going on with grandma, things like that. You can connect with people both in your neighborhood or in your loved one's neighborhood. And you can use calling, phoning, or texting to just kind of vent to other people, get some support. And if you're not the direct caregiver for your loved one, but you are, let's say, a sibling or something like that, and you're geographically separated from your loved one, keep asking, right? So it's not just that you ask one time how you can be supportive. It's something that you have to continuously engage in, because maybe they don't need you right now, but maybe in a month or so, once the person's back home or once some other corner has been turned, they might need your help and support. Thanks, Laura. So then on a societal level, seeking out support from religious or community organizations can be incredibly helpful. There's all kinds of people out there who are ready and waiting to help you and your family. You might also consider FMLA. Even though it's not paid leave time, it is time that's dedicated to situations like this. You can also work on enhancing transportation or legislative advocacy for greater support. I know that different states have had different caregiving bills on the table in the more recent years to offer financial and medical support to those folks. Telehealth is another way to enhance that support system. That's why I offer that as part of my practice. So sometimes I see caregivers who really can't get away, or maybe they don't have the amount of time to come to a 1-hour appointment with 30 minutes of transportation on either side. So by offering telehealth, they don't have to come up with an opportunity for someone else to watch their loved one. We're able to just meet and talk in a separate room. And last, I want to underscore the role of identity. So different people come from different sociocultural backgrounds. Maybe they have a different socioeconomic status or a different ethnic background. And all of those play into the ways that we engage in caregiver support. So certain cultures might want to stick together, keep a loved one in the home. Um, Other folks might not be able to afford extensive caregiving services. And so those are things on a societal level that we could be doing to enhance caregiver self-care. There are a lot of people on your caregiving journey who can help you. So there's home health aides, there's peer support, different organizations, depending on what disease or illness your loved one has, offer different support resources. So I encourage you to build up a strong community of support. There do, or there can be times when it's time to see a licensed mental health professional. And I've got a few examples here where you actually need psychotherapy. And the biggest one is if you're having thoughts of harming yourself or your loved one. That's a very serious concern. I've got some resources on the next slide that I'll talk about, but that's definitely one where it's time to reach out and see somebody who has a license, who is trained in this area. Other times when you need to see a mental health professional would be if you're feeling very overwhelmed and isolated, and the support that you've generated is just not helping you. Or maybe you've had a rupture with a care recipient or with a family member over your care recipient's care, in which case it's time to try to talk to someone about how to resolve those conflicts. If you've been putting off an important decision, or that you're recognizing that maybe the way that you're coping with this is very similar to ways that you've coped with other things in the past, and this is maybe a sign of a pattern of behavior, that's when it might be time to see someone who's trained in working with different mental health conditions. And if you're having any thoughts of harm, I highly encourage you to call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. Here's the number. It's 1-800-273-TALK or 8255. You do not have to be acutely suicidal to call. You can be very anxious. You could just need support. It's a free service. Give them a call if you're feeling like you're going to harm yourself or harm someone else. And the Family Caregiver Alliance also has a hotline that you can call with trained volunteers who can offer tips and support to you. All right, and that is the conclusion of my talk. So I know since we're recording this remotely, there won't be any questions probably. But if you do have any that come up after you've watched this, or you want to reach out, my contact information is there. Because of the coronavirus, I'm offering telepsychology services at a reduced rate. So if you are in need of support, please don't hesitate to reach out.